Picture this. Every word you whisper into your phone, every letter you carefully seal and send, every sign you hoist high in protest, watched. Not by some shadowy foreign enemy lurking in the dark corners of a distant land, but by your own government, cloaked in secrecy, wielding power without restraint. Your private conversations, the ones you thought were safe, are intercepted, dissected, filed away in some hidden vault. The letters you wrote, filled with dreams, fears, or mundane daily details, are pried open, read, and cataloged by faceless agents. The protests you joined, believing in the sacred right to raise your voice, are infiltrated, your every move tracked, your every chant recorded. This isn't the plot of a dystopian novel or a fevered conspiracy theory spun in the dead of night. This is real. A dark, undeniable chapter of American history where the government turned its gaze inward, betraying the very freedoms it swore to protect. When will the veil be lifted? When will public hearings, raw and unfiltered, drag this betrayal into the harsh light of day? When will the American people demand answers for the silent war waged against them by their own protectors? That, dear listeners, is the question that gnaws at the soul of a free nation. Who dares to hold the CIA accountable when it crosses that sacred line, transforming from guardian to predator? Who has the courage to challenge an agency so powerful, so secretive, that it operates in shadows even Congress fears to tread? This is no fiction spun for thrills, no tale crafted to chill the spine. This is Operation Chaos, a covert CIA program that slithered through the cracks of democracy, violating laws, shattering trust, and leaving a scar on the American spirit. It's a story of paranoia run amok, of a government so consumed by fear of external enemies that it turned its formidable machinery on its own citizens. Students, activists, parents, veterans, anyone who dared to question, to protest, to dream of a different world. This was the 1960s and 70s, a time when the Cold War's icy grip tightened around the nation, when the threat of nuclear annihilation hung like a storm cloud, and when the government saw communists not just in Moscow, but in the streets of Berkeley, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Imagine living in a world where your every step is shadowed, not because you're a criminal, but because you believe in peace, in justice, in change. Imagine the weight of knowing your government, the one you pay taxes to, the one you vote for, the one you trust to uphold the Constitution, is watching you, not to protect, but to control. Operation Chaos wasn't just a program. It was a betrayal, a violation of the social contract that binds a free people to their government. It was the CIA, an agency meant to hunt foreign spies, turning its sights on Americans, on you, on me, on anyone who dared to raise their voice. Welcome to Secrets Unleashed, where we rip away the shadows of the past to reveal truths that still echo in our present. Every week, we dive into the hidden corners of history, unearthing stories that the powerful would rather keep buried. Today, we embark on a journey into the heart of Operation Chaos, a program that didn't just bend the rules, it shattered them. This is a tale of secrecy and ethics, of a government that justified its actions with the flimsy excuse of national security, while trampling the rights of its own people. It's a story that asks, how far can power go before it becomes tyranny? And it's a story that demands we look at our world today, where surveillance cameras blink on every corner and algorithms track our every click, and ask, could this happen again? Let's set the stage. The 1960s were a crucible of change, a time when America was both soaring and splintering. The Cold War wasn't just a distant conflict. It was a daily fear woven into the fabric of life. Children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if flimsy wood could shield them from a nuclear blast. Families built fallout, shelters in their backyards, stocking canned goods against an apocalypse that felt all too possible. The US and Soviet Union were locked in a deadly dance, each move calculated, each misstep risking annihilation. But the fear didn't stop at the borders. Inside America, the nation was roiling. The Vietnam War, a quagmire half a world away, sparked protests that swelled from campuses to city streets. Young people burned draft cards, veterans tossed their medals, and ordinary citizens demanded an end to a war they couldn't justify. At the same time, the civil rights movement was rewriting the nation's moral compass. Black Americans, brutalized by segregation and systemic violence, marched for equality, their voices rising in defiance. "We're treated like colonized people," one activist cried, used, abused, discarded. Women's liberation groups demanded equal rights, challenging a society that confined them to kitchens and typist pools. Environmentalists, nascent but passionate, rallied to save rivers and forests. These weren't just movements, they were revolutions, shaking the foundations of a nation that prided itself on freedom. But to the government, these cries for change weren't signs of democracy in action. They were threats, potential breeding, grounds for communist influence. The paranoia of the Cold War twisted every dissent into a possible Soviet plot. A student chanting for peace? A communist sympathizer? A preacher demanding justice? A foreign agent? A mother protesting school policies? A subversive in disguise. This fear, this obsession with enemies both real and imagined, gave birth to Operation Chaos, a program that didn't just watch but infiltrated, manipulated, and sought to destroy the very movements it claimed to investigate. Who were the victims? Not spies or traitors, but people like Jane, a 20-year-old student who believed peace was possible. People like Robert, a father fighting for his children's future. People like Maria, who just wanted clean rivers. These were Americans exercising their rights, yet they were branded threats, their lives dissected by an agency with no legal right to touch them. Operation Chaos wasn't just a policy, it was a betrayal. A wound that cut deep into the trust between a people and their government. And the question lingers, who watches the watchers? When the CIA, an agency meant to protect, becomes the predator, who holds it accountable? When secrecy overrides ethics, when fear justifies tyranny, what's left of the freedoms we hold dear? These questions drove the exposure of Operation Chaos, when brave journalists and lawmakers tore back the curtain, revealing a government that had lost its way. And they drive us today as we navigate a world where surveillance is no longer hidden, but normalized. Cameras on every street, data harvested with every click, privacy a fading memory. So, dear listeners, prepare for a journey into the heart of betrayal. At Secrets Unleashed, we don't just tell stories, we uncover truths that demand to be heard. Operation Chaos is a warning. A reminder that power unchecked is power abused. As we dive into this dark chapter, we'll meet the people who suffered, the leaders who enabled it, and the reformers who fought back. We'll ask what it means to be free, and whether we're as free as we think. Join us, because the truth isn't just history, it's a call to vigilance, a demand to never let the shadows win. In the 1960s and 70s, America stood on a knife's edge, teetering between hope and dread. The Cold War cast a chilling shadow over every home, every school, every street corner, with the specter of nuclear annihilation looming like a storm that could break at any moment. Families built fallout shelters, stockpiling canned goods as if tin could shield them from Armageddon. Children practiced duck and cover drills, crouching under desks in a futile rehearsal for a war that could end the world. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a deadly dance, each move calculated, each misstep risking catastrophe. But the real threat wasn't just from distant Soviet spies slipping through the Iron Curtain. It was from within, from a government that began to see its own citizens as potential enemies, as shadows to be hunted in its own backyard. Operation Chaos wasn't about chasing foreign agents alone. It was a covert CIA program, cloaked in secrecy, that turned its gaze on Americans, students chanting for peace, activists marching for justice, everyday people daring to challenge the status quo. It wasn't enough for the CIA to monitor Moscow or Havana. It set its sights on Berkeley, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., treating dissent as a disease to be eradicated. This wasn't a program born of caution. It was born of paranoia, a belief that every raised voice, every protest sign, every call for change could be the work of a communist puppet master. I don't care if it's Russian communism or Chinese. Communism, one official barked, his voice dripping with conviction. It's communism, and it's a threat. Those words, spoken in the halls of power, encapsulated the mindset that fueled Operation Chaos. But was it true? Were the students, the preachers, the mothers protesting in the streets really pawns of a foreign power? Or was this a convenient excuse, a flimsy justification to silence voices crying out for peace, justice, and change? Was it a way to cling to control in a nation slipping into chaos, not from external enemies, but from its own internal struggles? Here at Secrets Unleashed, we don't just recount history. We unearth the human stories behind the headlines, the tales of courage, deception, and the relentless pursuit of truth that define our past and shape our present. Every week, we dive into the shadows, pulling back the curtain on the secrets the powerful would rather keep buried. Today, we plunge headlong into Operation Chaos, a program that didn't just bend ethical boundaries, it shattered them, broke laws, and left a deep, enduring wound on the American spirit. This is a story of betrayal, of a government that turned on its own people, of ordinary citizens who became targets simply for believing in a better world. Our journey will take us through the paranoia-soaked landscape of the Cold War, where fear of communism twisted every dissent into a potential conspiracy. We'll meet the ordinary people caught in the CIA's web, students like Jane who marched for peace, organizers like Robert who fought for equality, environmentalists like Maria who just wanted clean rivers. We'll uncover the government's secret machinations, the surveillance tactics that violated every principle of a free society, and we'll explore the fallout, the moment when the truth broke free, thanks to journalists and lawmakers who dared to challenge the CIA's unchecked power. This story isn't just history. It's a warning for our time, a reminder that the line between security and tyranny is razor thin, and that freedom demands vigilance. Stay with us, because the truth is rarely what it seems. Let's step back to understand the world that birthed Operation Chaos. The 1960s were a decade of upheaval, a time when America was both soaring with ambition and splintering under pressure. The Cold War wasn't just a distant geopolitical struggle. It was a daily presence, a specter that haunted every aspect of life. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had brought the world to the brink, with images of Soviet missiles 90 miles from Florida searing fear into the national psyche. Air raid sirens wailed in drills, and public service announcements instructed families on how to survive a nuclear attack. No matter where they go, one film warned, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. The message was clear. The enemy was out there, and no one was safe. But the enemy wasn't just in Moscow or Beijing. Inside America, the nation was fracturing along fault lines of war, race, and inequality. The Vietnam War, a conflict that seemed to have no end, ignited a firestorm of protest. By 1967, hundreds of thousands were marching, students burning draft cards, veterans throwing away medals, mothers and fathers demanding their sons come home. The 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago became a flashpoint, with protesters clashing with police in scenes that shocked the nation. "This is supposed to be a free country," one demonstrator shouted as tear gas filled the air. "But where's our freedom now?" The civil rights movement was another battleground, one that exposed America's deepest wounds. Black Americans, denied basic rights, faced violence and systemic oppression. The marches in Selma, the speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the cries of Black Power from Stokely Carmichael. These were calls for justice, but to the government, they were potential threats. Black people are treated like colonized people, one activist declared, brutalized, used, discarded. The government didn't just see a demand for equality, it saw a possible Soviet plot, a chance that foreign agents were stoking, unrest to destabilize the nation. Other movements were rising too. Women's liberation groups challenged a society that confined women to secondary roles, demanding equal pay and equal rights. Environmentalists, inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, rallied to protect rivers, forests, and air from pollution. Even these groups, seemingly innocuous, were viewed with suspicion. A mother in Chicago, organizing against forced school busing, voiced her frustration. "I don't care what color they are. Why bus my kid across town when there's a school right here?" Her words echoed a broader sentiment. A nation that prided itself on freedom felt increasingly constrained. Its people told what to do, where to go, how to live. This was the crucible in which Operation Chaos was forged. The government, led by men like Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, didn't see these movements as democracy in action. They saw them as vulnerabilities, as cracks where communist influence could seep in. The Cold War had created a climate of paranoia, where every dissent was a potential conspiracy, every activist a possible traitor. These aren't just protests, one official warned. They're breeding grounds for communist influence. This mindset wasn't entirely baseless. Espionage was real, with Soviet agents operating across the globe. But it led to a dangerous leap: the belief that American citizens, exercising their constitutional rights, were as much a threat as foreign spies. Operation Chaos was the result. A program that turned the CIA, an agency created to battle external enemies, into a domestic predator. It wasn't just about gathering intelligence. It was about control, about silencing voices that challenged the government's authority. It targeted not just the loudest activists, but ordinary people, students, parents, veterans, anyone who dared to speak out. The program's reach was vast, its methods invasive, its impact devastating. It didn't just violate laws, it broke the trust that binds a government to its people. At Secrets Unleashed, we tell these stories to remind you that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's a tapestry of human lives, woven with courage, betrayal, and resilience. Operation Chaos is a stark reminder of what happens when fear overrides ethics, when secrecy becomes a weapon against freedom. As we dive into this story, we'll meet the people who suffered under the CIA's watchful eye. Jane, a student whose hope was tainted by paranoia. Robert, a father whose fight for justice was branded subversive. Maria, an environmentalist targeted for caring about the earth. We'll uncover the tactics, phone taps, mail interception, infiltration, that turned democracy into a surveillance state. And we'll explore the moment when the truth broke free, when journalists like Seymour Hersh and lawmakers like Frank Church exposed the CIA's abuses, forcing a reckoning that changed America. But this story isn't just about the past. It's a warning for our time, a call to question the balance between security and liberty. Today, we live in a world where surveillance is ubiquitous. Cameras watch our streets, algorithms track our lives, governments and corporations collect data we barely understand. Operation Chaos asks us, where is the line? When does protection become oppression? And who watches the watchers when they turn on us? Stay with us, dear listeners, as we unravel this tale of secrecy and betrayal. At Secrets Unleashed, we believe the truth is a beacon, and we're here to light the way. The story of Operation Chaos is a journey into the shadows, but it's also a call to stand in the light, because the truth, as always, is rarely what it seems. To grasp the full weight of Operation Chaos, we must step back into the turbulent 1960s, a decade where fear and hope collided with explosive force, igniting a nation already stretched thin by division and distrust. The Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical chess game played by diplomats and generals in far-off capitals. It was a daily reality that seeped into every corner of American life, from suburban kitchens to urban streets. It shaped how people thought, how they lived, how they dreamed, and how they feared. The United States and the Soviet Union stood locked in a standoff so precarious that a single misstep could unleash catastrophe. Each side bristled with enough nuclear warheads to end the world several times over, and the threat of annihilation hung like a storm cloud, heavy and ever-present. In towns across America, air raid sirens wailed during routine drills, their piercing cries a grim reminder of the stakes. School children like Paul and Patty, barely old enough to understand the world's complexities, were taught to duck and cover under their desks, as if flimsy wood could shield them from a nuclear blast. No matter where they go, a public service film intoned with eerie calm. They always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. The message was relentless. Danger was everywhere, and vigilance was the only defense. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned goods, water, and grim determination, as if survival could be planned like a weekend camping trip. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when Soviet missiles were discovered just 90 miles from Florida, had seared this fear into the national psyche, proving that the threat was not abstract, but terrifyingly real. Yet the fear wasn't confined to missiles or foreign spies slipping through the Iron Curtain. At home, America was fracturing, its social fabric tearing under the weight of internal conflicts that rivaled the external ones. The Vietnam War, a quagmire 8,000 miles away, had become a lightning rod for dissent. By the mid-1960s, millions were marching, their voices echoing from college campuses to city streets, demanding an end to a conflict that seemed both endless and unjust. Students burned their draft cards in defiance, their flames a symbol of rebellion against a war that claimed thousands of young lives. Veterans, hardened by battle, joined the cause, tossing their medals onto the steps of the Capitol in acts of raw, public disgust. "I fought for this country," one veteran said, his voice breaking, "and now they're sending kids to die for nothing." The civil rights movement was another battleground, one that exposed America's deepest moral failures. Black Americans, brutalized and marginalized by centuries of systemic oppression, demanded equality with a ferocity that shook the nation. The marches in Selma, Alabama, in 1965, where peaceful protesters were met with batons and tear gas, became a searing image of resistance and repression. "We're treated like colonized people," one activist declared, her voice steady despite the violence she'd faced. Used, abused, discarded. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for justice, their words ringing out in speeches that challenged the nation's conscience. But others, like Stokely Carmichael, raised the cry of Black Power, a demand for self-determination that both inspired and alarmed. To many, these were cries for justice. To the government, they were potential threats, shadows where Soviet influence might lurk. Ordinary citizens felt the squeeze of a nation in turmoil, caught between a government preaching freedom and policies that felt like control. In Chicago, a mother named Clara stood at a school board meeting, her voice trembling with exasperation. "I don't care what color they are. Why bus my kid across town when there's a school right here?" Her question wasn't just about buzzing. It was about a deeper frustration, a sense that the government was dictating lives rather than serving them. Another voice, a factory worker in Detroit, echoed her sentiment. "This is supposed to be a free country, but they're telling me what to do, where to go, how to live. No freedom at all." These weren't radicals or revolutionaries. They were parents, workers, neighbors, people who believed in the American promise, but felt it slipping away. The 1960s were a crucible of change, a decade where hope and rage intertwined. Anti-war protests swelled, reaching a fever pitch during the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where protesters clashed with police in scenes broadcast to a stunned nation. "The whole world is watching," the crowds chanted as tear gas filled the air, a cry that captured both defiance and despair. The civil rights movement gained momentum, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but victories came at a cost. Violence, arrests, and the assassinations of leaders like Dr. King in 1968, which left the nation reeling. New movements emerged, each challenging the old order in its own way. Women's liberation groups, inspired by figures like Betty Friedan, demanded equal pay, equal rights, and freedom from a society that confined them to kitchens and clerical desks. "We're not just housewives anymore," one activist declared, at a rally, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We're here to change the world." Environmentalists, galvanized by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, took to the streets to save rivers, forests, and air from the ravages of pollution. A young volunteer in Seattle, planting trees along a polluted stream, said, "This is about our future, our planet." These movements, diverse and vibrant, were the heartbeat of a nation striving for progress. Yet, for every step forward, the government's fear grew. To those in power, these movements weren't just cries for justice or reform, they were potential threats, breeding grounds for chaos, and, most dangerously, possible fronts for communist infiltration. These aren't just protests, one official warned in a classified memo, they're breeding grounds for communist influence. This mindset wasn't entirely baseless. Espionage was a grim reality of the Cold War. Soviet agents operated across the globe, slipping through diplomatic channels, planting spies, and sowing disinformation. The CIA had uncovered real plots, from stolen secrets to covert operations. But this fear, grounded in truth, spiraled into paranoia, twisting every dissent into a potential conspiracy. A student chanting for peace in Berkeley? A communist sympathizer? A preacher demanding justice in Atlanta? A Soviet pawn? A mother protesting school busing in Chicago? A subversive in disguise? This paranoia led to a dangerous shift. The government began to view its own people as threats, not citizens. The principles of democracy, free speech, assembly, protest, were no longer sacred. They were vulnerabilities to be monitored, controlled, suppressed. This was the crucible that gave birth to Operation Chaos, a program that would turn the CIA's formidable powers against the very people it was meant to protect. The government's fear wasn't just about foreign enemies. It was about losing control. The 1960s were a time when the old order was crumbling, when young people, minorities, women, and workers demanded a seat at the table. The establishment, led by men like Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, saw this as a challenge to their authority, a threat to the America they knew. Johnson, a president consumed by the Vietnam War, believed Soviet agents were stoking domestic unrest. Nixon, a man driven by paranoia, saw enemies in every corner: students, activists, even his own political rivals. Their fears, amplified by the Cold War's relentless drumbeat, set the stage for a program that would betray the nation's core values. Operation Chaos wasn't just a policy. It was a mindset, a belief that the ends justified the means, that national security trumped individual rights. It was born from a government that saw dissent not as democracy's strength, but as its weakness. The CIA, an agency created to battle foreign threats, was unleashed on American soil, targeting not spies, but citizens. Students like Jane, who marched for peace. Organizers like Robert, who fought for equality. Environmentalists like Maria, who cared for the earth. These were the people who would bear the brunt of a program that saw every voice as a potential threat, every movement as a possible conspiracy. This paranoia, this fear masquerading as vigilance, was the spark that ignited Operation Chaos. It was a program that didn't just watch, it infiltrated, manipulated, and sought to destroy the very movements that defined America's struggle for progress. As we dive deeper into this story, we'll uncover how this betrayal unfolded, who suffered, and how the truth finally came to light. Because the 1960s weren't just a time of change, they were a time when America learned the cost of fear and the price of trusting those who wield power in the shadows. The birth of Operation Chaos in the sweltering summer of 1967, the spark was lit, igniting a fire that would burn through the fabric of American democracy. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a man haunted by the specter of Soviet influence, authorized Operation Chaos, a covert CIA program that would forever stain the nation's history. Johnson was a towering figure, his presidency defined by ambition and turmoil. But beneath his Texas bravado lay a gnawing fear that foreign powers were orchestrating the chaos tearing America apart. The Vietnam War was spiraling, protests were erupting, and the civil rights movement was challenging the nation's moral core. To Johnson, these weren't just domestic struggles, they were potential battlegrounds in a global war against communism. "My fellow Americans," Johnson declared in a speech that year. Addressing the nation after a Soviet leadership shakeup, the Soviet government announced a change in its leadership. Behind those measured words lay a deeper, unspoken dread that the Kremlin was funding the protests that filled America's streets, manipulating activists to destabilize the nation. Johnson wasn't alone in his suspicions. The Cold War was a time of real espionage, a shadowy world of Soviet agents, double agents, and covert operations. The CIA had uncovered plots, stolen secrets, infiltrated embassies, whispered conspiracies. But Johnson's response was a step too far, a leap into dangerous territory that would betray the very principles he claimed to defend. The CIA, created in 1947 to gather foreign intelligence and protect America from external threats, was now ordered to turn its gaze inward. This was a direct violation of its charter, which explicitly forbade domestic operations. The agency's mission was to hunt spies in Moscow, not monitor students in Berkeley. Yet, in the fog of war, ethics were cast aside like outdated relics. Johnson demanded answers. Were the Soviets behind the anti-war marches that clogged city, streets? Were they funding civil rights leaders who called for justice? Were foreign agents stoking the unrest that threatened his presidency? Operation Chaos began with a seemingly narrow mission: uncover foreign influence in domestic unrest. But it wouldn't stay narrow for long. The program was born in a climate of paranoia, where every dissent was a potential conspiracy, every activist a possible traitor. Johnson's directive set the stage for a surveillance operation that would spiral beyond its original scope, targeting not just suspected communists, but anyone who dared to challenge the government's authority. The CIA, with its vast resources and secretive culture, was uniquely equipped to carry out this mission, and uniquely dangerous when unleashed on American soil. The program's early days were marked by a frenetic energy. CIA operatives, accustomed to foreign battlegrounds, were now tasked with navigating college campuses and protest rallies. They pored over intelligence reports, searching for any hint of Soviet involvement. But the evidence was thin, the connections tenuous. Anti-war protesters weren't carrying Kremlin cash. Civil rights leaders weren't reciting Marxist manifestos. Yet, the lack of proof only fueled Johnson's suspicions, convincing him that the enemy was cleverer, more insidious than anyone imagined. When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, Operation Chaos took a darker, more sinister turn. Nixon was a man obsessed with control, his presidency defined by paranoia and a relentless need to crush his enemies, real or imagined. He inherited a nation in revolt, with anti-war protests growing fiercer and more widespread. Students clashed with police in fiery confrontations, their chants of "Hell no, we won't go" echoing across the country. Veterans, scarred by Vietnam, threw their medals onto the steps of the Capitol, their defiance a rebuke to a government they felt had betrayed them. "My fellow Americans," Nixon proclaimed in a televised address, "we must share the majesty of this moment." But behind the lofty rhetoric, his administration expanded Operation Chaos into something far more ominous than Johnson's original vision. Nixon didn't just want to find communist links. He wanted to silence dissent altogether. To him, the protests weren't just a challenge to policy. They were a personal affront, a threat to his authority. He saw enemies everywhere, not just in Moscow, but in the streets of Washington, D.C., the campuses of Berkeley and Chicago, even within his own government. His paranoia, fueled by a turbulent era, transformed Operation Chaos from a focused investigation into a sprawling machine of surveillance, its tentacles reaching into every corner of American life. The program's mission shifted. It wasn't enough to uncover foreign influence. It had to suppress any voice that dared to challenge the government's narrative. The machinery of surveillance. Let's pull back the curtain on how Operation Chaos operated, revealing a chilling apparatus that turned democracy into a surveillance state. Its stated goal was deceptively simple: uncover and neutralize foreign influence, particularly Soviet or communist support for domestic protests. But the methods? They were anything but simple. A vast arsenal of invasive tactics that stripped away privacy and trampled constitutional rights. The CIA, with its expertise in covert operations, deployed these tools with ruthless efficiency, creating a web that ensnared thousands of unsuspecting Americans. Agents infiltrated protest groups, posing as activists to blend seamlessly into their ranks. The Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, a leading anti-war organization, was a prime target. Undercover operatives, trained to mimic the language and passion of young radicals, attended meetings, took meticulous notes, and reported back to their handlers. "They were in our midst," one SDS member later recalled, her voice heavy with betrayal. "We thought they were comrades, fighting for peace, but they were spies, watching our every move." These agents didn't just observe, they manipulated, steering discussions, sowing suspicion, and undermining the group's cohesion. The CIA didn't stop at infiltration. They tapped phones, listening in on private conversations, late night, strategy sessions, personal confessions, even mundane chats between friends. The technology was crude by today's standards, but effective, capturing voices that thought they were safe. They intercepted mail, steaming open letters to read their contents, from heartfelt pleas to political plans. A young activist in Atlanta found her letters to her mother, filled with worries about the movement, had been opened and resealed. "It felt like a violation," she said, "like they'd reached into my soul." The scale of the operation was staggering. By the program's peak in the early 1970s, the CIA had amassed files on over 7,200 American citizens, a number that barely hints at the true scope of their surveillance. These weren't hardened criminals or foreign spies. They were students, teachers, pastors, parents, people who had done nothing more than exercise their constitutional rights to free speech and assembly. The data collection was relentless, a later investigator revealed, shaking his head at the sheer audacity. They didn't just target leaders. They watched anyone who spoke out, anyone who marched, anyone who dared to question. No group was too small or too peaceful to escape scrutiny. Anti-war protesters were obvious targets, their rallies swarming with undercover agents. But the CIA's net stretched wider, ensnaring civil rights activists, women's liberation advocates, and environmentalists planting trees or cleaning polluted rivers. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., already hounded by the FBI's COINTELPRO program, was a focal point for chaos. "I can't see why our nation is fighting 8,000 miles away in a civil war," he said in a 1967 speech, his voice resonant with conviction, unaware that the CIA was scouring his life for any hint of foreign ties. The agency found none, but that didn't stop them. They saw his influence, his ability to move millions, as a threat in itself. The agency's logic was chilling, a twisted calculus that turned dissent into danger. If you challenged the government, you were a potential threat. If you marched for peace, you might be a communist. If you fought for equality, you might be a Soviet pawn. This wasn't just surveillance, it was a campaign to control, to intimidate, to silence. The CIA didn't merely gather information, it actively worked to fracture movements from within, planting rumors to sow discord. "They wanted us to turn on each other," one activist recalled, her eyes narrowing at the memory. "They'd spread lies, say someone was a snitch, a traitor, until we couldn't trust anyone. The result was a nation under siege, not from foreign enemies, but from its own intelligence agency, operating in secret, answerable to no one." Operation Chaos didn't just violate laws, it eroded the trust that binds a democracy together. It turned neighbors into suspects, ideals into threats, and freedom into a hollow promise. As we delve deeper into this story, we'll meet the people caught in this web. Ordinary Americans whose lives were upended by a government they trusted. Because Operation Chaos wasn't just a program, it was a betrayal, one that would leave scars on the nation's soul. Let's step away from the cold machinery of Operation Chaos, the wiretaps, the covert infiltrations, the mountains of files, and meet the people caught in its gears. These aren't just names scrawled in CIA dossiers or faceless statistics in a government report. They're human beings, flesh and blood, whose lives were upended, whose trust was shattered, whose dreams were tainted by a government that saw them not as citizens, but as threats. Operation Chaos didn't just violate laws, it broke hearts, fractured communities, and left scars that lingered long after the program's exposure. Through the stories of Jane, Robert, Maria, and others, we see the true cost of unchecked power, the human toll of a betrayal that cut to the core of what it means to be American. Jane, the student activist Jane, was 20 years old in 1968, a sociology major at UC Berkeley, with a long braid that swung as she marched and hand-painted protest signs tucked under her arm. She was a fixture at anti-war rallies, her voice rising above the crowd as she chanted for peace in Vietnam. To Jane, the movement wasn't just politics, it was a calling, a belief that young people could end a war that tore families apart. "We were young, full of hope," she later said, her eyes still bright with the memory of those days. "We believed we could stop the killing, make the world better, force the government to listen." But Jane didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know that every rally she attended, every flyer she handed out, every late-night debate in a smoky Berkeley cafe was being meticulously recorded. Her CIA file, uncovered years later during the church committee hearings, was a chilling portrait of her life, a document so invasive it seemed to strip away her very identity. It listed her classes, Sociology 101, American History, her friends' names, her roommates' habits, even the coffee shop where she argued politics over cheap, bitter coffee. "They knew I liked my coffee black," she said, her voice breaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "They made me feel like a criminal, like I was some kind of spy. All I did was speak out, march, believe in something. The surveillance changed Jane. The girl who once danced through protests with fearless optimism grew paranoid, her eyes darting to strangers in the crowd. She began second-guessing her friends, wondering if the new faces at meetings were comrades or CIA plants. "I stopped trusting people," she admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "I'd wonder, is this person one of them? Is that guy with the notebook reporting back to someone? That's what they wanted, to break us, to make us doubt each other." Jane's file was just one page in a mountain of documents, but it carried the weight of a life altered by betrayal. She continued marching, but the joy was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear that she was never truly free. Robert, the civil rights organizer in Atlanta, Robert was a father of two, a man whose broad shoulders carried the weight of a community's hopes. He'd seen the worst of segregation, Jim Crow's humiliations, lynchings in the shadows, children denied schools because of their skin. By 1967, he'd vowed to fight it, organizing voter drives, marching alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and speaking at churches about equality. "We were fighting for our lives," he said, his deep voice steady with conviction. "The government should have stood with us, not against us. We weren't asking for handouts, just the rights they promised in that Constitution they love to wave around." But to the CIA, Robert was a threat, a potential subversive whose ties to civil rights leaders made him suspect. His file, revealed in the 1970s, was a catalog of intrusion. His phone was tapped, his conversations with fellow organizers recorded. His mail, including letters to his wife about their children, was opened and photographed. Once, at a planning meeting, in a church basement, Robert noticed a stranger asking too many questions, his eyes too sharp, his interest too calculated. "I knew something was off," he said, shaking his head. "He didn't belong, didn't feel like one of us." That stranger, he later learned, was a CIA operative, one of many embedded in the movement to sow discord and gather intelligence. The betrayal cut deep, a wound that never fully healed. "This was our government," Robert said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "They treated us like enemies, not citizens. We were trying to make America better, and they saw us as the problem." The surveillance shattered his trust in authority, a trust he'd held despite the injustices he'd faced. He kept organizing, leading voter drives that brought thousands to the polls, but the fear lingered. Every call, every letter, he said, "I wondered who was listening, who was reading. You couldn't escape it." Robert's story wasn't just about violated rights. It was about a man who fought for justice, only to find his own government standing against him. Maria, the environmentalist. Then there's Maria, a young woman in Seattle whose love for the outdoors defined her life. In 1969, she joined an environmental group, spending weekends planting trees along polluted streams and cleaning rivers choked with industrial waste. With her muddy boots and sun-freckled face, Maria was no radical. She was a dreamer, inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring to protect the planet for future generations. "I was just trying to save the Earth," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Why was that a threat? Why did that make me someone to watch?" Her CIA file, uncovered years later, was as baffling as it was invasive. It noted her attendance at eco-rallies, her letters to local newspapers about pollution, even her participation in a community cleanup day. "They called me a radical," she said, laughing bitterly at the absurdity. "A radical for caring about clean water, for wanting birds to have a home. It's like they couldn't stand anyone who cared about anything." Maria's story lays bare the absurdity of Operation Chaos, its relentless need to see threats in every corner, even in a young woman planting saplings. No movement was too small, no person too ordinary. If you raised your voice, you were a target. The surveillance left Maria shaken. She'd always seen the government as distant but benign, a force that built parks and protected forests. To learn she was watched, labeled, filed away as a potential danger, it changed her. "I started looking over my shoulder," she said. "I'd hesitate before writing a letter, wonder if my phone was safe. It made me feel small, like I didn't matter." Maria kept working, her hands in the soil, but the innocence was gone. Her story is a testament to the program's overreach. its ability to turn even the gentlest acts of care into suspected subversion. The unsung. Many Jane, Robert, and Maria were just a few of thousands swept into the CIA's net, their lives dissected by an agency that saw dissent as danger. But they weren't alone. Across America, countless others, students, teachers, mothers, workers, found themselves targeted for nothing more than living their beliefs. In Chicago, a young mother named Clara organized against forced school busing, standing up at community meetings to demand better schools for her children. "I was just a parent," she said, her voice cracking with indignation. "Why me? Why was my name in some secret file?" Her file, revealed in the 1970s, noted her attendance at meetings, her conversations with neighbors, as if her fight for her kids was a national security threat. Clara's story shows how Operation Chaos reached into the lives of ordinary people, turning everyday struggles into suspected conspiracies. In Boston, a Vietnam veteran named Tom protested the war he'd fought in, marching with fellow soldiers to demand an end to the bloodshed. He discovered years later that his letters to his fiancée, filled with hopes for a peaceful future, had been opened and copied. "I served my country," he said, his voice raw with betrayal. "I saw friends die in that jungle, and this is how they repaid me, spying on me like I was the enemy." Tom's file labeled him a disgruntled veteran, as if his pain, his protest, made him a traitor rather than a patriot. Then there was Lena, a women's liberation activist in New York, who fought for equal pay and reproductive rights. Her file detailed her speeches at rallies, her friendships with other feminists, even her visits to a local bookstore. "We were talking about freedom," she said, "the same freedom they said we had. But they watched us like we were criminals." Lena's story highlights how Operation Chaos targeted emerging movements, seeing threats in women who dared to demand equality. These stories, and thousands like them, reveal the human toll of Operation Chaos. Not just violated rights, but broken trust, fractured communities, and a fear that silenced voices. The CIA didn't just watch, it poisoned the well of democracy, turning neighbors into suspects and ideals into threats. Activists grew wary, movements splintered under the weight of suspicion, and ordinary people hesitated to speak out, fearing unseen eyes. The program's true damage wasn't in the files it created, but in the trust it destroyed, the sense of freedom it eroded. As we move forward in this story, we'll see how these lives, these betrayals, fueled a reckoning, a moment when the truth broke free and America confronted the cost of its government's paranoia. Because Jane, Robert, Maria, Clara, Tom, Lena, and the unsung many weren't just victims. They were the heart of a nation fighting to reclaim its soul. Secrets like Operation Chaos, no matter how deeply buried in the shadows of government secrecy, can't stay hidden forever. For years, the CIA's domestic spying program operated in darkness, its invasive tentacles reaching into the lives of thousands of Americans, all under the guise of national security. But in December 1974, a crack appeared in the wall of silence, and the truth began to surface, thanks to the relentless courage of one journalist who refused to let the story die. This moment of revelation, and the seismic fallout that followed, would expose the full scope of Operation Chaos, shake the nation to its core, and force a reckoning with the dangers of unchecked power. Seymour Hersh, a dogged investigative reporter for the New York Times, was the spark that ignited the fire. Known for his tenacity and unyielding commitment to truth, Hersh had already made waves uncovering government abuses, including the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. In late 1974, he published an explosive exposé that ripped the veil off Operation Chaos. "I have friends loyal to the Constitution," Hersh said, his voice steady with conviction, "who know their duty is to the truth." His article laid bare the CIA's domestic spying, detailing how the agency had violated its charter by targeting American citizens, students, activists, ordinary people, whose only crime was exercising their constitutional rights. Hersh's reporting was a bombshell, a meticulously documented account that revealed a staggering betrayal. The CIA, meant to protect America from foreign threats, had amassed files on over 7,200 citizens, tapped phones, opened mail, and infiltrated peaceful protest groups. The article described a program that didn't just skirt the law, it obliterated It operating in secret with no oversight, no accountability, and no remorse. The public was stunned, their faith in the government shaken to its foundations. "This isn't the America we know," one citizen wrote in a letter to the editor, her words trembling with disbelief. "How could our government betray us like this? How could they spy on us, their own people, like we're the enemy?" The outrage was palpable, a tidal wave of anger and betrayal that swept across the nation. Protests erupted in cities from New York to San Francisco, with citizens taking to the streets to demand answers. Placards reading "Stop spying on Americans" and "CIA out of our lives" bobbed above crowds outside government buildings. In Washington, D.C., a young woman stood on the steps of the Capitol, her voice raw as she shouted, "This isn't freedom, it's a police state." The sentiment echoed in letters to newspapers, in heated town hall meetings, in conversations around kitchen tables. Americans who had grown up believing their government was a beacon of democracy now faced the chilling reality that it had turned against them, watching, listening, and manipulating in secret. Congress, under intense pressure from a furious public, could no longer ignore the scandal. The revelations were too damning, the evidence too overwhelming. In January 1975, President Gerald Ford, newly sworn in after Nixon's resignation amid the Watergate scandal, took action. Recognizing the need to restore public trust, he established the Rockefeller Commission, led by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, to investigate the CIA's activities. "Can you get it done in 90 days?" Ford asked the commission's head, his tone urgent. "You can do anything in 90 days if you go after it," came the reply, a promise of swift action in a nation desperate for answers. The Rockefeller Commission's work was grueling, a dive into the murky depths of CIA operations. Over months, they pored over classified documents, interviewed agency officials, and pieced together a picture of systemic abuse. Their findings, released in June 1975, were damning. The CIA had spied on thousands of Americans, breaking laws, trampling constitutional rights, and violating its own charter. The commission confirmed that Operation Chaos had targeted not just suspected communists, but peaceful activists, civil rights leaders, and everyday citizens. It revealed a program that had operated with impunity, its leaders dismissing legal boundaries as mere inconveniences. The report was a wake-up call, but it was only the beginning of the reckoning. The real turning point came with the formation of the Church Committee, a Senate Select Committee led by Idaho Senator Frank Church in 1975. The committee's hearings were a spectacle of truth-telling, a public airing of the government's dirty laundry that captivated the nation. Broadcast on television and covered exhaustively by the press, the hearings pulled back the curtain on the full scope of Operation Chaos and other intelligence abuses. Over months, the committee uncovered a litany of wrongs: files on 7,200 American citizens, illegal mail-opening programs that had operated for 2 decades, and CIA agents embedded in peaceful groups like the Students for a Democratic Society and environmental clubs. The testimony was chilling, a parade of revelations that left the public reeling. One official, testifying about the CIA's counterintelligence chief, James Angleton, said with grim irony, by ulcer medication, he had no apology for a 20-year illegal program. Angleton, a shadowy figure whose paranoia had fueled much of Operation Chaos, saw no fault in his actions, believing the ends justified the means. The committee revealed even more disturbing details. Letters to and from American politicians, including a 1968 note to Richard Nixon, had been opened, photographed, and filed away. The CIA had even monitored correspondence between ordinary citizens and their elected representatives, a brazen violation of democratic principles. The public's reaction was visceral, a mix of shock, anger, and disillusionment. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered, their signs demanding accountability. "This isn't freedom," one young man said, his voice hoarse from chanting. "This is a police state, and we're done with it." In letters to newspapers, citizens poured out their betrayal. A teacher from Ohio wrote, "I teach my students about democracy, about rights. How do I explain this? How do I tell them their government spied on them for marching, for speaking, for caring?" The Church Committee's findings shook the nation to its core, forcing Americans to confront a painful truth. The government, entrusted with their protection, had violated their trust in secret, without cause, for years. The hearings weren't just about exposing wrongdoing. They were about reclaiming democracy. Senator Church, a soft-spoken but resolute figure, became a symbol of accountability. "We want to keep this country free," he declared in a televised address, his words resonating with a nation hungry for change. That means exposing wrongdoing and safeguarding our rights, no matter how powerful the wrongdoers may be. The committee's work was exhaustive, producing a 6-volume report that detailed not just Operation Chaos, but a broader pattern of intelligence abuses, including the FBI's COINTELPRO and NSA surveillance programs. It was a historic effort, a moment when the government turned the mirror on itself and faced its own failures. The fallout was transformative, a seismic shift in how America approached intelligence and civil liberties. In 1978, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, a landmark law designed to regulate intelligence activities and protect Americans' rights. FISA established a secret court to oversee surveillance requests, ensuring that agencies like the CIA couldn't target citizens without judicial approval. It was a direct response to Operation Chaos, a safeguard against the kind of unchecked power that had allowed the program to flourish. Permanent congressional oversight committees, including the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and its House counterpart, were established to watch the CIA and other agencies. These committees were tasked with reviewing intelligence operations, holding agencies accountable, and preventing future abuses. "We can't let this happen again," one senator said during the FISA debates. "The CIA answers to the American people, not the other way around." The reforms were a step toward transparency, a recognition that democracy thrives on trust, not secrecy. Operation Chaos became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. It was a lesson written in the lives of those targeted. People like Jane, the student activist who lost her trust in community; Robert, the civil rights organizer who felt his government turn against him; Maria, the environmentalist branded a radical for planting trees. For them, the scars lingered long after the reforms. "I'll never see the government the same way," Jane said years later, her voice still tinged with pain. "They stole our trust, and you don't get that back." Robert echoed her sentiment. "We fought for justice, and they fought us. That's a wound that doesn't heal." Maria, reflecting on her file, said simply, "I just wanted to help the earth. They made me feel like a criminal for it." The reforms were a step forward, a hard-won victory for accountability, but they didn't erase the damage. The question lingered, haunting the nation's conscience. Could it happen again? The Church Committee had exposed the CIA's abuses, but it also revealed a deeper truth. In times of fear, governments are tempted to sacrifice liberty for security. The Cold War had fueled Operation Chaos, but what about future crises? What about a world where technology made surveillance easier, more pervasive, less visible? For those who lived through it, Operation Chaos was more than a scandal. It was a betrayal that reshaped their view of America. The protesters who marched, the journalists who uncovered the truth, the lawmakers who fought for reform, they reminded the nation that democracy is fragile, that freedom requires vigilance. As we reflect on this chapter, we see not just a story of abuse, but a story of resilience, of a people who demanded better, who refused to let the shadows win. Because Operation Chaos wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action, a demand to protect the rights it sought to destroy. Operation Chaos isn't just a relic of the past, a dusty chapter tucked away in history books. It's a warning etched deep in the annals of American memory, a stark reminder of what happens when fear overrides reason and power goes unchecked. In the 1960s and 70s, a government consumed by Cold War paranoia turned on its own people, justifying betrayal with the flimsy excuse of national security. Students like Jane, organizers like Robert, environmentalists like Maria, they weren't spies or traitors, yet they were watched, targeted, and silenced by the very agency sworn to protect them. Operation Chaos was more than a program. It was a violation of trust, a wound that lingers in the collective soul of a nation that prides itself on freedom. Any spy agency must look outward, a reformer insisted in the wake of the scandal, their voice trembling with resolve. Not trample on Americans' rights. Those words, spoken in the aftermath of the Church Committee's revelations, were a rallying cry for accountability, a demand that the CIA and its ilk never again turn their gaze inward to prey on citizens. Yet, as we stand here in 2025, Those words feel less like a victory and more like a challenge, an urgent call to examine our own time, where the lessons of Operation Chaos are more relevant than ever. Today, we live in a world of mass surveillance, where cameras blink on every corner, algorithms track our every click, and governments and corporations vie for the data that defines our lives. The question looms large. Have we heeded the warning of Operation Chaos? Or are we sleepwalking into a new era of control, cloaked not in Cold War paranoia, but in the sleek guise of technology and convenience? At Secrets Unleashed, we bring you these stories every week, not to dwell on the past, but to illuminate the present. History isn't just a record of dates and events. It's a guide, a map that warns us of pitfalls and points us toward a better path. Operation Chaos teaches us to stay vigilant, to question power, to demand transparency from those who wield it. It reminds us that democracy is fragile, that the line between security and tyranny is razor thin, and that freedom requires constant defense. This journey into the shadows of Operation Chaos, through the paranoia of the Cold War, the lives upended by surveillance, the fight to expose the truth, has shown us what happens when secrecy overrides ethics, when protection becomes a pretext for control. And it begs the question that haunts us still. Could this be happening again, right now, under our noses? Let's pause to reflect on the world we inhabit today, because the parallels to Operation Chaos are chilling. In the 1960s, the CIA tapped phones and open mail, crude tools by modern standards. Now surveillance is woven into the fabric of daily life, so pervasive it's almost invisible. Walk down any city street, and cameras capture your face, feeding images into databases you'll never see. Scroll through your phone, and algorithms track your searches, your likes, your thoughts, building profiles that predict your behavior with eerie precision. Governments, citing threats of terrorism or cybercrime, collect vast troves of data, emails, texts, locations, often without oversight or consent. Corporations, from social media giants to data brokers, harvest your digital footprint, selling it to the highest bidder. The revelations of Edward Snowden in 2013, exposing the NSA's PRISM program, were a modern echo of Seymour Hersh's 1974 expose. PRISM, like Operation Chaos, collected data on Americans with little regard for privacy or legality, scooping up phone records, internet activity, and metadata in the name of security. It's not about catching terrorists, Snowden warned. It's about control. His words sparked outrage, much like Hersh's did decades earlier, but the response was fleeting. Reforms were proposed, hearings held, yet the surveillance state grew stronger, emboldened by technology that makes the CIA's 1970s tactics look quaint. Today, facial recognition software identifies protesters in real time. Social media platforms flag suspicious posts, and artificial intelligence sifts through data faster than any human ever could. What happens when this power falls into the wrong hands? Operation Chaos showed us. A government paranoid about communism targeted peaceful activists, labeling them threats. Today, the labels have changed. Extremist, misinformation spreader, radical. But the logic remains. Protesters, journalists, whistleblowers, anyone who challenges the status quo, can find themselves watched, their data weaponized against them. In 2021, reports surfaced of the FBI monitoring Black Lives Matter activists, echoing the CIA's surveillance of civil rights leaders like Dr. King. In 2023, X posts revealed concerns about government requests for user data from tech companies, often without clear justification. The tools have evolved, but the mindset, fear masquerading as vigilance, feels eerily familiar. The human cost of Operation Chaos wasn't just in the files or the wiretaps. It was in the trust it shattered. Jane, who once marched with hope, grew paranoid, her friendships strained by suspicion. Robert, fighting for equality, felt his government brand him an enemy. Maria, planting trees, was labeled a radical for caring. Today, the stakes are higher, the impact broader. Every time you hesitate to post a controversial opinion online, fearing it might be flagged or tracked, you feel the shadow of surveillance. Every time you cover your webcam or encrypt a message, you're reacting to a world where privacy is no longer guaranteed. The chilling effect is real, silencing voices before they even speak, just as Operation Chaos sowed distrust among activists decades ago. So, what do we do? How do we heed the warning of Operation Chaos in a world where surveillance is normalized, even celebrated? At Secrets Unleashed, we believe it starts with awareness, with stories that pull back the curtain and demand accountability. History shows us that change is possible. The Church Committee's hearings, sparked by Hirsch's reporting, led to FISA and oversight committees, reforms that curbed the CIA's abuses. The public's outrage, channeled through protests and letters, forced Congress to act. Today, we have the same power, to question, to demand, to push back. But it requires courage, a willingness to challenge systems that seem too big to fight. Transparency is the antidote to secrecy. We must demand clear rules for data collection, robust oversight of intelligence agencies, and protections for whistleblowers who expose abuses. We must hold corporations accountable, refusing to let convenience trump privacy. And we must stay informed, because ignorance is the ally of control. Operation Chaos thrived in the dark, its victims unaware they were targeted. Knowledge is our defense, a light that keeps the shadows at bay. This story, like all the stories we tell at Secrets Unleashed, is a call to action. If this journey into the shadows of Operation Chaos gripped you, if it made you question the world we live in, then join us in the fight for truth. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications for our weekly dives into the truths others want buried. Every view, every share, every comment amplifies these stories, ensuring they reach those who need to hear them. We're not just a YouTube channel, we're a community of truth seekers, united by a belief that history's lessons must guide our future. Want to go deeper? Check out our video on the FBI's COINTELPRO, the sinister twin of Operation Chaos, to see how far the government went to silence its own people. COINTELPRO targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and others with tactics even more ruthless than chaos, from blackmail to assassination plots. It's a chilling companion to this story, a reminder that Operation Chaos wasn't an isolated abuse but part of a broader pattern. Watch it, share it, and let us know what you think, because your voice matters. In the comments below, we want to hear from you. How do the lessons of Operation Chaos apply to today's world of digital surveillance and privacy? Are we safer because of mass data collection, or are we trading freedom for a false sense of security? What can we do to protect our rights in an age where technology outpaces the law? And the question we can't ignore, the one that keeps us up at night: could this be happening again? Right now? Under our noses? Is there a modern Operation Chaos, hidden in algorithms or classified programs, targeting today's activists, journalists, or dissenters? Share your thoughts, your fears, your ideas, because this conversation is how we start to change the world. Let's talk about what's at stake. Operation Chaos wasn't just about spying. It was about control. About a government deciding who could speak, who could dream, who could challenge the status quo. Today, that control takes new forms. Social media platforms under pressure from governments, censor posts labeled as misinformation, but who decides what's true? Intelligence agencies, citing national security, collect data without clear limits, but who watches the watchers? Corporations profit from our data, shaping our choices without our consent. But who holds them accountable? These are the questions Operation Chaos forces us to ask, the questions that define our fight for freedom in the 21st century. As we close this chapter, let's remember the people who paid the price: Jane, Robert, Maria, and the thousands whose stories we'll never know. They weren't just victims, they were fighters. People who believed in a better world and paid for it with their privacy, their trust, their peace. Their legacy is our responsibility. A call to stand up, speak out, and demand a world where power serves the people, not the other way around. Join us next week on Secrets Unleashed as we uncover another hidden truth, another story that challenges what we think we know. Our mission is to shine a light where others cast shadows, to give voice to the silenced, to remind you that the truth is worth fighting for. Until then, keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop demanding the truth. Because in a world of secrets, vigilance is our greatest weapon, and history our greatest guide. Stay curious, stay bold, and stay with Secrets Unleashed.